Good morning, everyone. My name is Mary Catherine Duffy, and I am the Director of Professional Development here at SAES, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar on best practices of board treasurers. I'm joined today by Rob Devlin, our Executive Director. Hi, Rob.
Good morning.
We're so glad everyone's here. This is our first time to do this on a Zoom call rather than a webinar. And so I think we're going to have a little bit better interaction. And I want to give you a few housekeeping items before we begin. As Rob said, we want to provide you with best practices for those of you who are on this call for board treasurer, but we are not a legal entity. And so SAES kind of likes to put out a standard disclaimer that the information that we're giving you is our thoughts and information that we feel is best practice. We always recommend that if you are making decisions that you consult your legal counsel. So with that being said, a couple of things about interaction. We do want you to interact today. We want you to ask questions. We're going to have a presentation, but there's going to be lots of opportunity for questions and comments. If you will put those in the chat, this is because it's a Zoom call. There's no Q&A box. There's going to be chat. So we'll have that in the chat. If you just want to stick that in the chat, we'll be watching it. And I think that's it. This is recorded. So for those of you watching this recording, we're glad you're here as well. And let's get started. So as I said, I want to first of all find out a little bit about you who are on the call. So if you don't mind putting in the chat, putting kind of what school you're at, what your role is at the school. We want to know a little bit more about you. And that will be helpful to us as we provide information and get questions from you. So put your name, put your role and your school in the chat. When we do Zoom calls like this, we don't sometimes, especially if it's for a board, we don't know where school you're from. And so that's really helpful. We've got people we got St. Thomas Episcopal School. We've got Matthew, tell us where you're from. St. Albans Harlingen, currently serving as treasurer for both church and school and on the boards of both endowment funds. Andy Knight, head of school. Debbie Smith, incoming treasurer. We've got St. Mark's Cathedral School, and we've got the treasurer at St. Luke's, San Antonio. Great. Thank you so much. Okay, so again, I'm going to give you the opportunity you put your stuff in the chat, but if we need to get clarification, Rob's going to be kind of watching the chat for me as I go through here. And he's going to interrupt me as needed so that we can make sure that we have the questions answered in a timely manner. But I do have some content. We'll have some poll questions that I'm going to want you to participate in. But let's just go ahead and jump in. So today's agenda is going to be pretty simple. We're going to talk a little bit about the role of the board treasurer. I want you to understand a lot of times people are new in this position and they're not really sure what their actual job is. So we're going to talk about that. And then we're going to talk about the best practices for operating for good financial management. And we talk a little bit about this in a variety of webinars. So this isn't the only time you'll hear this. Look, I am a marketing major and I had to take a lot of accounting. Okay. And that's great, but accounting doesn't really change. It's pretty cut and dry. And so a lot of what we talk about over and over again, but we want to do that because I think there's a lot of people in the school world that may not understand what's best practice for good financial management. So we do repeat that a lot, but I think it's important. And then finally, we're going to end up talking about what does it look like to have a successful relationship with between the board treasurer and the head of school. So that's going to be important as well. So I would love for you to answer this question in the chat. What questions did you bring today? If there are specific things that you are already thinking about, go ahead and throw those in the chat. Rob will be watching them. And as we get to it, if we haven't gotten to it by the end, we're going to circle back and get to it. So I think there will be a lot of things that get answered, but I don't want you to be able, I want you to be able to remember your question. If you're anything like me, you have the question and you need to write it down. So let's do that right now. So what is the role of the board treasurer? What is that role? Well, it's pretty simple, and yet it's complex. So the number one role is that you chair the finance committee. And we're going to talk a little bit later about if there is a finance committee, but if there is a finance committee, which there should be, the board treasurer is the chair of that committee. Another role you have is to assist with budget development. As the school prepares the budget, and we're going to kind of talk a little bit about a budget calendar, you assist with that. Now, do you do it by yourself? Absolutely not. There's a lot of people that should be involved in that process, but you do assist with it. You ensure regular review and reporting. That includes the monthly kind of conversations that you have with the board around what the financial situation of the school looks like. And you ensure best practice in school operations, which is one of the reasons that you are here probably, is to understand what those are. So what are the thoughts on chairing the finance committee? I think it's really important, if you have not thought about a finance committee, that you consider this. One of the best practices that we look for, and even in the standards, the documents in adherence to standards, we're going to ask that question as an accrediting association. What is your finance committee doing? How often are they meeting? And so this is something that's going to be a way that you can lead. And that is to ensure that you have a regular finance committee meeting, that you're doing that on a monthly basis, that you serve as the chair of that committee, and that you work with the head to set the agenda for that committee. Now, you don't set the agenda without working with the head, and the head doesn't set the agenda without working with you. And you'll notice that I talk a lot about that because I think it's really important. Rob, I know that we talked a little bit about this at the leadership and governance, and I'd love your thoughts on it. But in leadership and governance, in the business section, what we talked about is that that we work as a group, and to put all of the responsibility for finances on the school head is difficult and inappropriate. But sometimes in small schools, the head comes in with not much financial knowledge, and the board treasurer has the financial knowledge. And so what happens is that the finance treasurer will just take over and do the budgeting and do the setting of the agenda and do all of that. And I really encourage you, if that's your situation, to not do that, because the head of school is the CEO of the company, and they need to know what they're doing and need to know how to look at the finances. And you can help them with that, but to do it yourself, or to have the head do it all of themselves, is not good practice. Finally, representing the board and ensuring that best practices are taking place at the school. So I think that your role is to to be overseeing that, to ask questions about how the business manager is handling cash, to ask questions about, are we looking at the budget every single month and presenting that to the board? Those questions need to be asked. And I think if anybody's going to ask them, it should begin with you. Hopefully the head of school is asking them too. And but if they're not, I think it's an appropriate question for you to ask. Rob, do you have thoughts on that as far as the treasurer's role in all of that?
Well, I'm 100% in agreement with what you're saying, Mary Catherine. And I think a couple of key things that I've seen go sideways with schools are when a board treasurer kind of works in his or her own silo, or works without communicating, and kind of cuts the head of school out of the process. And likewise, when the head of school just kind of barges through, I think that any kind of partnership that can develop between a head of school and a board treasurer, very similar to the head of school and the chair of the board, I think is very important. But the other piece I'd like to mention, depending on the structure of your school, if you have a business manager, you know, more than just a bookkeeper probably, but a business manager at your school, I think that the relationship between the business manager and the board treasurer is extremely important as well. And I think those two, because they have the financial understanding, the knowledge, probably a lot more in depth than a head of school might have, I think that can be a very powerful team. But that communication needs to be in place, and not cutting the head out of the conversation, always including the head, but that direct communication, I think, between the business manager and a board treasurer can be extremely, extremely helpful.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, because it's really a team effort when it comes to, especially in schools where there's a head of school and a business manager, maybe smaller schools where the admin is head of school, business manager, and that's who does the finances of the school. That treasurer is kind of that third person that kind of you work together. Now, is the head of school going to have as much financial knowledge as a business manager? Probably not, sometimes, but probably not. So the idea is not to only work with the business manager, because that kind of gets in the weeds. But it's also, you've got to have that business manager relationship as well, because they're doing the day-to-day stuff. And so I appreciate you saying that. One thing that I do want to tell you is that you should be taking minutes at your finance committee meetings, and that should be a matter of record. And so that's going to be in your documents in adherence to standards when you are accredited. If you're an accredited school, that's going to be something that we look for. And so I really recommend, they don't have to be long minutes, but they do need to be documented, and you need to keep them somewhere, preferably in the business office, so that when it's time for that accreditation visit, you can go look for those. Okay, so here's a poll question that I have, and it's, does your school, let's see here. Oh, sorry. Polls. Finance committee. Does your school have a finance committee that meets monthly? Yes, monthly, yes, but less often. Our school has a finance committee, but doesn't meet. Our school does not have a finance committee. So if you will just take a minute to fill that poll out, that would be awesome. You would be surprised at the number of schools that we find that don't have a finance committee. And what happens is that primarily it's the treasurer. The treasurer is the finance committee. Okay, we're going to end that poll and let's see. So yes, we have 5 out of 6 that are meeting monthly. Great. And 1 that's meeting less often. So that's awesome. I like that. That's what we want to see. Okay, so let's talk for just a minute around budget development. Budget development is really something that sometimes board treasurers either take over and do all of it, and kind of cut out the business manager and the head of school, and they just kind of do all of it, or they don't get involved in it. And what I recommend is that you assist the head of school with the creation and presentation of the annual budget, and that the business manager is participating in that planning. Why does the business manager have to participate? Well, in my situation, the business manager was the one who could create all the data, all the historical data for me to take a look at when we started. And we began with just the head of school and the business manager kind of creating the data, putting it all in a spreadsheet, taking a look at historically where we have been, taking a look at what we feel like we're going to hit in terms of enrollment projections. And we would do all of that kind of behind the scenes work before we met with the treasurer. Then we would meet with the treasurer. And the treasurer, the great part about that is that many times as a head of school, we're stuck in the weeds. We're stuck in the forest, and we can't see everything. And so for the treasurer to come in after you've done that and take a look at what you've done and ask questions, that's a great methodology, I think, because then you can have questions asked of you that you're not thinking about because you're in the weeds. And so that's going to be really important. And again, you'll hear me say this regularly. Please ask questions. Lots of questions. That's really important, because as you are walking through this process, the asking of the questions is going to get you to the best result. And sometimes treasurers are afraid to ask. They think, well, maybe I shouldn't ask. Maybe that's getting in the weeds or whatever. But I think asking questions is really important. Rob, do you have thoughts about that?
I don't know how much more detail you're going to go into the budget development, but I would love to understand from your perspective, Mary Catherine, what that timing of that is in the course of the year, kind of what some of those milestones are month by month, on preparing that budget and the steps that go into that. I've seen many of the schools that we visit just kind of throw something together at the last second, and they throw things together that say, hey, it looks like we're gonna have this many kids and we're gonna charge them this much, so let's build the budget on that number. And I think that's probably not the best practice. Are you going to drill down into that a little bit?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that, and that's a great question. What does it look like? So I've given you a little bit of a calendar. Now remember that this is something we do, actually a webinar called the Budget Planning and Dashboard. That's a 2-hour webinar that goes a little bit deeper into this, but this is a sample of the budgeting calendar. So in September and October, this is when I would spend time reviewing previous and current budgets, assessing trends, establishing an enrollment goal. And it seems early sometimes for you to do it here, but it's really not, because it takes a while to get this accomplished. This is also when I'm working primarily with the board chair, kind of thinking through what do we know is coming? What are, we're going to have to buy new curriculum next year, but not the next. And so creating this data and gathering all this data in September, October is helpful. In November is when we would tend to create a preliminary budget and a recommendation for tuition and compensation for the coming year. Now, remember that those are the two big rocks. We're thinking about tuition and we're thinking about compensation, and what are we going to need? So in order to know what I'm going to need for compensation, I have to think about enrollment projections. Am I going to need an additional section of second grade? Am I going to add in a new enrichment subject? Am I going to add any administrators? What is the strategic planning calling for? What does our strategic plan say? We will add another senior administrator this year. So we take a look at all of that and we create a budget that gives us a recommendation. And to Rob's point, what you don't want to do is go, well, this is what we think we're going to do, and this is what we're gonna, this is how we think what we'll need, and so let's just kind of throw a rock in there and figure out what the tuition should be. What we want to do is we want to back into that tuition, and that's what that webinar that we do for budgeting and dashboard really kind of talks through. In December, the Finance Committee tends to present a recommendation for the board to approve tuition and compensation. You can do this in January. I have done it in January. It's a little tricky to get it done in January, because January is when we start to send out and prepare all of our marketing, and it would be better to get this done in December, I think. November is kind of when you jump in, I think, as the treasurer and start to work with the board, with the head of school and the business officer. And so I would like to see probably October, November, where you start to get involved in this budgeting process. January and February, we would continue to work on the budget. We watch re-enrollment trends. Most schools are sending out contracts in January and February. March and April, we're usually bringing in new students and new contracts. We're watching the enrollment, and typically end of March is when I would do a preliminary budget that was presented to the board to be approved. Now, again, a preliminary budget this is what we think is going to happen for the next school year. This is where we think we'll spend our money. This is what we think our enrollment will look like. And it could change, and it probably will. But we do approve it, because then it helps us to get out contracts and that sort of thing. Then May and July, we monitor, we make budget amendments as necessary. And then August is when a approval of a final budget is presented. And that's usually when we know what the enrollment is. What we like to say is butts in the seats. We know who's here. We know what teachers are here. And we can get a good solid, if hopefully there's not a huge difference. Hopefully we've gained 10 or 15 students over what we thought we would do in March. Hopefully it's not, we've lost 10 or 15 students. Obviously, sometimes that happens, but that's when you approve a final budget. Questions about that as we go through?
So Mary Catherine, go back to that last slide for a second. So a couple of things that I've seen at other schools that are slight variations of this basic practice is, obviously having that August there at the end, really, I think it would be wise to think about that as the beginning of the consideration, right? So, because that's where we are right now. I think our boards and our finance committees and our treasurers need to be looking at all the final numbers, enrollment wise, contract wise, teacher, and that's where you approve that final budget and then get to work on the next year's. But as you see in each one of these months, if you don't have any kind of long range strategic plan in place, then you're always just putting out fires. So I think it's really important also to think about long range. It's when you're thinking about programmatic initiatives and curricular initiatives and additions of staff and capital projects and those kinds of things that could affect your budget. And then the other thing that I've seen some schools do, I like how there's the big buckets of tuition and compensation that are kind of pre-approved in the December, January timeframe. I've seen a lot of schools go ahead and take this, just lost it, take the budget amendment.
Sorry. There we are.
Take that preliminary budget and actually pull that up into the January meeting and approve a preliminary budget before they set tuition, not just the compensation side of it, but if there's big strategic initiatives that they're trying to accomplish, then perhaps creating that preliminary budget in full to drive and help them understand what tuition needs to be based on realistic enrollment trends based on real data from the past 10 years.
Right.
I think some schools do it that way, where they do the preliminary budgets before they send out their enrollment contracts.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think the points about having the long range financial plan be a part of the September, October, November conversation, that's got to happen. And if you don't have a long range financial plan that goes with your strategic plan, you must have that, because a strategic plan that says, oh, we're going to do this over the next 3 years, but we don't ever talk about how we're going to pay for it, that's not helpful. And so I love that. And I agree about you can do that preliminary budget and approve that well before March. That's absolutely true. So I think the key is for you to find a system where you're starting early and you're thinking about it well before January, where you go, oh gosh, we have to figure out tuition. And that's what happens a lot. And it's just not helpful. So thanks for that, Rob. Okay, so let's talk about the next thing, which is, what does it mean to review and report? So I think it's really critical that there be transparency and that the board understand. This is something that we teach boards all the time. You have a fiduciary responsibility as a board member. And so you can't be the board member that says, well, I don't know anything about money, so I'm just going to let the treasurer worry about that. And I just won't worry about that. If they say it's a good budget, I'll go for it. No, we all have a fiduciary responsibility as a board to pass a budget. We don't pass a budget individually, we pass it as a board. So having said that, it is your responsibility as the treasurer to make sure that you are having that reviewed monthly, that you're presenting a treasurer's report every single month at a board meeting, that you're ensuring an annual audit, which we're going to talk about in a minute. All of those things are really important. I would not recommend that you review the financials right before the board meeting, right before you have to prepare and present it. That can be pretty stressful for business managers. And so as a former head of school, I have had board treasurers who would wait till the last minute and then call us about, 10 minutes before the board meeting and say, hey, can you show me the financials? And then they go to the board meeting and they ask a question that they should already know. And so I really recommend that you take the time to look at the financials for prior to that meeting and look for accounting errors, financial errors. We're all human. That's going to happen. And that's just that second person looking at it to make sure that if there is an error, you can get that corrected. And so I really recommend that you take care of that and that you make sure that you're reporting. Now, one thing that Rob and I've talked about, and I think Rob's school did this, This idea, Rob, of a dashboard, a monthly dashboard, as opposed to presenting a balance sheet and a cash flow P&L. What are your thoughts on that? Because I know at St. Albans, and I don't know, Rex, if y'all still do this, but we would present the financials as a balance sheet and a P&L to the whole group. But I think there were times where it would have been helpful to have a dashboard. So Rob, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we shifted about halfway through. I spent the past 17 years at St. George Episcopal School in San Antonio, and we shifted from kind of the standard, budget presentation, balance sheet, and income statement report to a dashboard model, because we realized that oftentimes many of our board members kind of just glaze over. They don't really understand those financial statements as well as the treasurer and the business manager might. But if we're able to present those numbers in terms that they can understand and in terms of dashboards, and compare that to what we expect to be seeing versus what we are actually seeing, and then have a couple of best practices with respect to key metrics that we're always measuring ourselves against, and then having our board treasurer explain that each week and walk through that. Takes about 20 minutes, but then it becomes very familiar. There's key indicators that show us, we're on track, we're not on track, we're in the green, we're in the red, wherever it is. And we developed this dashboard for the key metrics that really helps non-financial people understand their fiduciary responsibility and get a quick, big picture of where we are. Of course, we have the ability to drill down into the specifics of the balance sheet and the income statement if we need to, but that dashboard was kind of a game changer and put us all on the same playing field and gave us a common language to understand what we're looking at.
Yeah, I love that, because I think that would be really helpful. Again, you guys who are treasurers are typically financial people, or you wouldn't be a treasurer. And but to have people on your board that can really understand, they're going to be better board members because they're understanding and they're engaged in that process. So I do encourage that.
Hey, Mary Catherine, do we have an example of any of those?
I have seen, I've seen examples. I've actually, Brian Denny gave me an example of that that he used, and we could probably find some if you will, if you'll email me, and let me put my email in the chat. I'll see if I can find, I'll see if I can find some that we could share with you that would be good examples of that, because I really do think it's a really good practice to consider. So regular financial review, head of school and business manager are reviewing financials monthly. I think this is really critical, especially if you have a head of school that doesn't really understand the finances, that you're making sure that they're doing that, that the finance committee led by the school board treasurer reviews the financials monthly at their finance meeting. Does that need to be a dashboard? Maybe not. You should probably be looking at the actual P&L and balance sheet as a finance committee. And then up-to-date financials should be presented to the board every month. We kind of talked about that. One thing that I would say too is that, and this is really for a parish day school, but I think it's important. Some schools and churches, when the vestry will get the financials of the school every single month. I don't know what St. George did. At St. Albans, we did do that. And I liked that because I thought that was an important kind of relationship building process, that they see that what we're doing every single month, as long as the priest was pretty strong in making it, or the board treasurer, or the treasurer of the vestry made sure that it wasn't the vestry's job to dig deep into why I'm spending this on curriculum or spending that on whatever, but that it does give the vestry kind of an understanding of where the school is each month. I don't know, does St. George do that monthly or less often, or what did they do?
So we do that on a monthly basis, but not directly to the vestry, but through the vestry representative on the school board. Okay. And through the ex officio membership of the senior warden on the board. And then we would do that holistically with the board and with the entire vestry through our audit report every October. and present the entire financials, the fully audited financials directly with the auditor. And then we would do another one at the church annual meeting in January. So there's two big overviews on an annual basis, and then the monthly was handled through the vestry representation on the board itself.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, so let's talk about best practices in the operations. So number one, now this is not allowed in every diocese, so we do understand this, but we recommend that you incorporate the school as a legal entity, a separate legal entity. Again, that doesn't mean that the vestry loses complete control over the school. Sometimes people think that. It doesn't mean that. I've seen a lot of schools, St. Albans, St. George, St. David's, lots of schools that are separately incorporated but have excellent relationships between church and school. So we do recommend this as a best practice. Establish clear lines of authority. The vestry empowers the board to do the work of the school. The board hires the head of school, and the head of school manages the budget and oversees operations. A business officer is an employee of the head of school. So this is important for the main reason that sometimes when there's a new head of school that comes in, maybe there's been a treasurer or that's been with the board business officer for a long time. The business officer's been there a long time. I've seen cases where the treasurer and the business officer work together and kind of cut out the head of school, and that is not a best practice. So we want to really encourage you to remember that the business officer is the employee of the head of school and not an employee of the board. Separate accounting between the church and school if you're a parish day school. Ensuring competent accounting, making sure that whoever's doing your book work is competent and capable, and then ensuring the financial transparency, which is kind of what we've been talking about, the reviewing of the school's financial reports monthly. So some more best practices that you should think about. Again, high quality bookkeeping is critical. You have to make sure that whoever's doing that bookkeeping is capable and knows what they're doing, that you're following a calendar for the budgeting process. We talked a little bit about that. Regular financial review. We've talked a little bit about that. Having a risk management plan. Is this the job of the treasurer? I think it's the job of the treasurer to bring it up for sure. Do I think you need to be doing the risk management plan by yourself? No, probably not. But definitely taking a stand that there be a risk management plan in place. Ensuring that there's a shared use agreement between the church and school. If there's not a shared use agreement, there should be. And I think it would be important for you to press that and ensure that there's conversation and written down around how do we share expenses. If we have a shared employee, how does that handled? Again, we don't want to be reactive. We want to be proactive. And so that's a really important, also really important for the relationship between the church and the school. Having a PRISM account, this is a provision for plant replacement, renewal, and special maintenance. Things like, for me, I don't know why I have this mental image that maybe it's burned in my memory from my first year. I started in June, and 2 weeks after I started, we had the big package AC unit above my office died a terribly tragic death. And it was a $6,000 hit, and we weren't prepared for it. And so it's really important that we're always thinking about where are we putting money aside for things where that's going to happen, or special maintenance when we know we have to replace the carpet, or we have to replace the flooring, or we have to paint the school, or whatever it is. So having a PRISM account, special funds that are controlled by the board, things like, and this is something, again, most of what I teach, I've experienced. I'm sure that Rob has the same thing, but when I came into the school, we had a bunch of different checking accounts. We had the parent association had their checking account, and we had grade levels that had their own bank accounts from their bank sale. And really all of that should be under the umbrella of the business office. Now, can there be separate accounts for all that to keep up with it? Yes, of course, but it shouldn't be separate accounts with people signing checks. It should just be separate accounts internally. And then finally, ensuring professional development funds are available if your head of school needs financial training. this is a little bit of a frustration on my part defending the heads that I know, but because I came into my job really with more financial knowledge than I had educational knowledge, this wasn't an issue for me. But I have seen over and over people who have taken on the role of the head of school that did not know the expectation that they would have around needing financial knowledge. And then I've seen boards be frustrated because their head of school doesn't know about running a $2 million business. And the reality is that if your head of school doesn't know that, you've got to help them. You've got to give them the training they need. Either you're giving it to them, you're sending them somewhere, but we're giving them the PD that they need to know how to do this. Because it's not, Rick Kellogg always said, our heads of schools, they didn't get in the business of being a head of school because they wanted to be an accountant. They did it because they love kids, they know education, and we got to give them the training that they need, just like we would do with our teachers. Rob, you have thoughts on that? I don't know that you had that issue.
Well, certainly I'm not an expert in financial matters at all. That wasn't my background in college, but I did work in the business world on the consulting side, but more on the tech side of things. But yeah, it's a big step up, and particularly if you have a new head and there's lots of transitions going on currently or pending. And I just know that when you bring this new head in, there's a ton of things that they're trying to pay attention to. And that's not in their comfort zone 9 times out of 10. And so what Mary Catherine's talking about is, things like New Heads University, or the New Head Symposium with ISM, or there's lots of different groups out there. And a big portion of that training will be, hey, here's what you need to know as the CEO of your organization with respect to the finances of your operation. And I think that's just super, super helpful. And so, but a lot of heads will come in and the board won't approve or won't include that in the budget, right? That they'll see, okay, yeah, here's what we're going to pay for the new head. Make sure you have in that budget opportunities for them to go and do that learning. It's money well spent.
Yeah, I agree with that. So poll question, I'd be interested, if you're a parish day school, we'd like to know, is your accounting separate from the church's accounting? So let me stop sharing this. Let's do the next poll question. So are you separating your accounting from between church and school? Excellent. We have a 100% yes. That's good news. I never like to see that we're mixing funds. That's awesome. Okay, so then we don't really need to spend a lot of time on this, but just as a reminder, if you guys don't know this, it's a standard for those funds to be separated, and that the school oversees the funds, the school board oversees the funds of the school. So it can't take place if that's not separate. And that it's the best practice that the vestry gives the power to the school board to steward the finances of the school. So let's talk a little bit about what high quality bookkeeping looks like. This is probably not new for you, but it would be good for you to be able to teach this to your bookkeeper or your head of school. Cash is registered as soon as it arrives. We don't let cash just sit around. You guys know this, but if you're new as a board treasurer, you may not. I don't know that there's any organization that has more transactions in a day, financial transactions in a day, than a school, between tuition and fundraising and the bake sale in 4th grade or the t-shirt sale in 1st grade. The number of transactions are vast. And it's a lot, and mostly it's cash. A lot of times it's cash. Now, before Venmo and these kinds of things, Cash App, probably it was more, but still, we have to register cash when it arrives, and we can't just keep cash sitting around. Physical assets are registered and kept up to date. We're paying attention to what we own. We're reconciling bank statements every month. 2-party signatures are required on large checks. Accounting files are backed up daily on and off site. Head of school is approving all checks over a defined amount. So notice I didn't say the treasurer oversees and approves checks because that's really not the job of the treasurer. Sometimes there will be a treasurer on the two-party check, and that's fine. It's more convenient, to be truthful, to have somebody other than the treasurer be the second signature, because otherwise you're going to have to be driving up to the school on the regular, which is a pain. No one wants to have to do that. Head of school approves and defines. We already said that. Invoices and check stubs are kept together in a vendor file, and we're watching for fake vendors. There's a lot more, but these are just some of the big ticket items that Rick Kellogg would talk about, that were things that he saw regularly. So let's have a question, another poll. I want to know, does your school have an annual review or audit by an independent firm? So let's see here. And it can be a review or an audit. We want to know if you're doing that. Oh, excellent. 6 out of 6. God, you guys are rock stars. Y'all are winning. So we don't need to really tell you a lot of reasons for why we would need an independent audit, but I will tell you just a couple of things. As you know, bookkeeping can be complicated. And I loved knowing that there was an auditor that was going to find the mistakes, because we were going to have mistakes. Now, let me just tell you that most business managers don't see it that way. They don't like mistakes. They don't want to be caught. They don't want a mistake. But to me, it just felt like it was just good protection for me to know that there was going to be somebody else that was asking some questions. Again, kind of that whole question, making good decisions requires that it be transparent, and we're looking at everything from an outsider's perspective. Audits offer an invaluable planning tool, and it is an SAES standard. And so that's going to be really important that you follow that. And that mistakes can cost, I think, a lot more than, sometimes mistakes can cost a lot more than what an audit or review would have cost. So we really want you to consider that. And if you're, and when other people are asking why you have an audit, if your board is asking why that is, we do know it's expensive, but these are some good reasons why you should have it.
And Mary Catherine, just a word about that last bit. And the reason I want to mention it is I don't know where your particular school might be in the accreditation cycle currently. But several years ago, the Standards Association of the board and the board itself approved a change, which I'm finding that some schools are not aware of, which is what you have at the bottom of that screen, with respect to when is a review acceptable versus when is a full audit required. And the cutoff for that is the $1 million in revenue. If you're under $1 million, you can alternate between audit, review. But if your revenues exceed $1 million, then the association, as part of our standards, requires a full audit every year. And I'm finding that some schools, because of where they are in the accreditation cycle, when that pops up, their visit pops up, they were not aware of that. And so I just wanted to point that out to the folks on this call. Yeah,
that's good. Thank you for doing that. So keys for a successful relationship between the head of the school and the treasurer. Number one, communicate. Monthly meetings to discuss financials, insisting on transparency, being cleared with established roles. I think in communicating with your head of school, it's going to be critical that you just say to them, there's not a dumb question. You can ask any question you want to ask, because none of us want to look like we don't know what we're doing. But I can tell you, heads particularly want to be sure that they don't look incompetent in the eyes of their board or in the eyes of their treasurer. And so I think setting the stage for saying, I want to help you, and I realize that this is not where you don't come from a business background, or you wouldn't be in this job. So let me help you learn, and feel free to ask questions, and I'm going to feel free to ask questions, and we're going to meet monthly and discuss the financials so that we're all on the same page. I think that's really critical. Collaborating, working together on the annual budget, working with the finance committee for good decision making, creating a financial dashboard and long range financial plan. Shout out to our financial budgeting and dashboard webinar. It's going to be, I think, in October. And it's a 2-hour webinar where we go into a deep dive around how to budget and how to create a financial dashboard, which is a historical dashboard as opposed to what Rob is talking about. The historical dashboard talks about, we look at enrollment over the past 10 years. We look at the costs over the past 10 years. We look at teacher salaries over the past 10 years. Those kinds of things, along with a long-range financial plan, will help you understand the big picture finances of the school and help you make good decisions. So collaborating on those is important. And then nurturing and supporting. Again, I cannot stress this enough. If you have a head of school that needs support in this area, please push for getting the support that they need, whether it's you giving it to them. I realize that not every school has tons of money, and we like to spend professional development money on our teachers because that's kind of a direct influence over our students. But the reality is that our head of schools, our heads need that support too. They need financial training if they need it, and they need PD money to do it. So encourage you to do that. Engagement in the treasurer's role is crucial. And if you are not engaged, your school is going to suffer. If you are too engaged, where you're doing all the work, your school is going to suffer. So I encourage you to find that balance and engage, but and be supportive, but and to just do the role that you're supposed to do. So let's see, we are at, oh, good. We're at about 10 till. I'm going to go ahead and stop the share. You are going to get a copy of this, so no worries if you missed something, but would love the opportunity to answer questions if you have them. I'm happy to unmute you. What are you thinking? It's a lot of information in 50 minutes, I know. Questions or comments? You can put it in the chat if you don't want to talk. You guys are all rock stars. So. Okay, Andy, what is it? There was
something about check stubs being kept together in the vendor file. Can you tell me a little more about that?
Well, that's just a matter of making sure that I think it's really from a fraudulent standpoint, just making sure that we're keeping our stuff organized. Okay. I think that, I'm not an auditor, obviously, but one of the things that Rick wanted to make sure that we were always looking for is the opportunity, obviously, for embezzlement or whatever. And so there have been times, and I don't know if Rob has anything to say about this that he's seen, but on-site visits that I've been on where I saw business offices that were just super unorganized, and they just weren't keeping things together. You couldn't find, if I needed to know why did you spend money on this? And where's the check that shows that you bought that? People couldn't find it. So I think that's really what it kind of comes down to. Rob, anything that I'm missing on that?
I'm sorry, I was looking for a copy of my dashboard to try to share.
Oh, no worries. No worries.
That would be great. I would love to see that.
Yeah, we're going to try to share some of that with you as well. But that's a good question, Andy. Thank you. I really just think it's a matter of, and this is a place where I think you can really be helpful as a treasurer, especially if you're an accountant. The idea around these best practices and making sure if you're thinking what it's going to be like when the auditor comes, it will be helpful to those business managers and those heads who are trying to keep organized. Tell them how you want them to do it. If you've got experience with audit or review, then that would be really helpful for them to know how to set things up so that we don't have that issue. Mm-hmm. Other questions? Feel free to put it in the chat or.
And to Rex, I will share that dashboard. I don't want to share private information from my previous school without their permission.
No, that's fine. I think, I'm just interested in what metrics you use.
Yeah, absolutely.
Might have been non-financial.
Absolutely. And I'll show you a kind of a scrubbed example when we get that from them. But basically what it looks at is, year to date. So there's the top section of it is kind of an analysis of review versus expenses in key categories such as tuition, financial aid contributions, and auxiliary income. And we analyze that year to date on budget, year-to-date actual, and what the variances are. And then we compare that to projections as well, right? And then we do the same thing with expenses, and we look at the big buckets, right? Personnel, curriculum, administrative, facilities, and auxiliary expenses. And then we do that analyzation too, to kind of show us where we are from a budget perspective, where we are in an actual perspective, and what our variances are. And then our treasurer will go through and say, okay, here's a little variance analysis to our budget. For example, our tuition fees are a little higher because we actually exceeded some of our enrollment expectations, and our contributions are higher than we had planned. But on the expense side, health insurance premiums were way higher, and we offered some extra pay and bonuses to some folks, and so that made a change. There's also some other fees that we didn't anticipate. So there's why. Here's what the variance is, and here's the reasons why. That's important, I think, at a high level for the board members to know. And then we do same thing on a projection level moving forward, right? Here's where we anticipate to continue to have variances with respect to revenue or expenses. And then we do some nice fancy, graphs and pie charts, so you can kind of get an understanding of, from an operations standpoint, what percentages of our budget is coming from tuition and fees, what's coming from contributions, what's coming from other programs that we administer. And then the same thing on the expense side. Where are we spending our money? What percentage is going to personnel, what's going to curriculum and classroom, what's going to facilities, what's going to administrative. And that helps us make sure that we're kind of best practice with respect to how we're spending our money and where we're receiving our money. And then the key metrics we look at is always retention, days of cash, and these are some important things from SAES. The general reserves is a percentage of the operating budget. Again, that's a big one that we would always look at, and we always set a floor of at least 25% of our general reserves. At least our general reserves would always be at least 25% of our annual operating budget. And then with room to grow above that, we would understand what the current ratio was, the net debt per student. If we have some debt, that's important. Understanding percentages of annual fund participation as a metric to see, gauge kind of, what kind of buy-in are we getting from families. And then understanding also where our this was a big one for us. We were tracking compensation as a percentage of our annual operating budget, right? To make sure that we were appropriately compensating the people in our community. And then using that number to compare with, best practice out there, industry standard wise for schools. Then we'd have a quick little look at the balance sheet, and a quick little look at all of our reserve balances and loan activity, so that people are aware of, okay, here's kind of where our general reserves, here's our maintenance reserve, here's our facility reserve. We've got the construction loan balance, and here's kind of when that's going to be paid off. So people have an idea of, what do we have in savings and what do we have obligations long-term. That's important. And then the bottom section was enrollments, and that's a big one, right? So we tracked enrollment for the past 2 years to understand by grade level where we are, where we're up, where we're down, what our trends look like. And then the same thing with tuition rates to understand kind of what the slope of that curve looks like with our tuition. Is it gently sloping? Is it spiking? Is it dropping? And then we always have a little section on this, and this is all in a one-page sheet that reminds everybody of key dates and milestones for board work throughout the year with respect to the finance committee. So that in June, we look at summer programs. In July, we look at insurance renewals. In August, we look at audit. In September, we look at finalizing the budget for the current year. In October is when we do joint meetings with the board and the vestry to be very transparent on the audit and shared expense side and renew our shared use agreement. In December, we would again build our November, December build preliminary budgets. January, finalize preliminary budgets and set tuition. February is enrollment contracts, March is faculty contracts, and then April and May is the budget projections and capital expenditures conversations. So that's just a set thing that reminds us of what our agenda is for the year to keep everybody on track and keep them thinking at a strategic fiduciary long range perspective as opposed to getting in the weeds. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
indeed,
And
that's-
Rob, did you do all of that every single month?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so
So-
we presented this dashboard with that information every single month. And then my board treasurer would go through and say, okay, look on the budget side, here's how we're doing, here's why, here's the
Right.
variances. Just a reminder, here's some of the big picture things. So that looks good or it doesn't look good, or we're trending in the wrong direction here. The balance sheet, again, is just to remind everybody of the overall health of the organization. And then the key metrics were really important. Those are the key things that we know that, if we start seeing some numbers on retention that we don't like, that's an early indicator that we got some work to do. The reserves and the days of cash and the loans and the balances.
And a lot of that you're talking about, you guys, is also on that 10-year. A lot of those same metrics are on the 10-year dashboard that you're going to look at. You're not going to look at that 10-year dashboard every single month like you would what he's talking about, but it does exist. So there's a lot of similarity between those two dashboards. And I think once you get into the idea of dashboarding, it is really helpful to your board, especially those people who need kind of just a big picture. And I love the idea of the calendar. So that the rest of the board that's not on that finance committee knows what the work is that the finance committee is doing. So I love that. So we'll do our best, guys, to if you'll email me, I'll put my email in the chat. We'll take a look at seeing what we can do to find you some examples of dashboards like what Rob is talking about.
Cool.
And yeah, Rick, I see your email there, so I'll get that out. And so I'm going to ask Elizabeth Keeney to just kind of put some dummy numbers in so you can understand the concept without her having to disclose her, school's particulars, financials.
Right.
And then we'll move forward from there. Does that work for you, Rex?
That's good.
Yes.
Rex.
Yeah, it works fine. Thank you.
Okay, so any final questions? We're right at the top of the hour. I want to say thank you to Rob for that. That was great because I think that's going to be really helpful. And I do encourage you to take a look at the SAES website and look at the webinars coming up to see about that webinar on financial dashboarding and budgeting. It's a good one. Final questions? Okay, just want to say thank you again. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. For those of you who are watching this on recording, thanks for coming. And we're going to stick around for just a minute if you have any additional questions. Y'all have a great day.